The morning light filtered through my kitchen blinds as I sat with my coffee, staring at the sympathy card that had arrived yesterday. It was from someone I barely knew, expressing their understanding of what I'd been through and how brave I was for surviving my marriage. My hands trembled as I read the carefully chosen words that painted my late husband David as some kind of monster, when in reality, he'd been the gentlest soul I'd ever known. The card was just the latest in a series of these uncomfortable encounters. Last week at the grocery store, a woman I recognized from church had approached me with that particular look of pity, telling me how she finally understood why I seemed so withdrawn at social gatherings. The week before, my neighbor had made a comment about how I was healing beautifully from my trauma. Each interaction left me more confused and hurt than the last. Before I reveal what really happened, please hit that subscribe button and like. I love hearing from viewers. What's your city? My name is Margaret Nelson, I'm 48 years old, and I've been living in this quiet suburban neighborhood for over 20 years. David and I moved here when we were newlyweds, full of dreams and plans for the future. He passed away from cancer 18 months ago, leaving me to navigate this world alone for the first time in decades. The grief has been overwhelming, and yes, I suppose I have seemed different to people who knew us as a couple. I've been quieter, more reserved, sometimes canceling social plans when the sadness felt too heavy to bear. But what I was discovering was that my best friend, Sarah Mitchell, had been providing her own explanation for my changed demeanor. Sarah, who had been by my side through David's entire illness, who had held my hand at his funeral, who knew better than anyone how deeply we loved each other. Somehow, she had begun telling people that my withdrawn behavior wasn't grief at all, but rather the signs of someone recovering from years of abuse. The realization hit me like a physical blow as I sat in my kitchen that morning, pieces of conversations suddenly making terrible sense. Sarah's hushed tones when she thought I wasn't listening, the way certain friends had started treating me with kid gloves, the pitying looks that seemed to go beyond normal sympathy for a widow. My daughter Emma Nelson, now 24 and living across town, had been the first to notice something was off. She'd mentioned it during one of our weekly dinners, saying that some of her friends' mothers had been asking strange questions about her childhood, wondering if she was okay and if she needed to talk to anyone about her father. Emma had been confused and defensive, not understanding why anyone would question the loving home she'd grown up in. "Mom, Mrs. Peterson asked me yesterday if Dad had ever hurt you," Emma had said, her voice full of bewilderment. "I told her she was crazy, but she just gave me this look like she knew something I didn't. What's going on?" I hadn't known how to answer her then, but now I was beginning to understand. My neighbor and longtime friend Janet Walsh had also mentioned some odd interactions recently. Janet, who worked at the local library and seemed to know everyone in town, had been hearing whispers. People were asking her about our family, wondering if she'd ever noticed signs during all the years we'd lived next door to each other. "Margaret, I didn't want to worry you while you're still grieving," Janet had told me just last week. "But there are some strange rumors going around about David. People seem to think he was, well, that he wasn't the man we all knew him to be." As I sat with that sympathy card in my hands, I realized the scope of what was happening. David's memory was being systematically destroyed by someone I trusted, someone who knew the truth but was choosing to rewrite our story for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. The man who had brought me flowers every Friday for 23 years, who had coached Emma's soccer team, who had cried when he received his cancer diagnosis because he was afraid of leaving me alone, was being painted as an abuser. The betrayal cut deeper than the grief itself. I thought about all the times Sarah had sat in my living room over the past year and a half, listening to me share memories of David, watching me cry over losing him. She had nodded sympathetically, offered tissues, brought casseroles, all while secretly telling our mutual friends and acquaintances that my tears were relief, not sorrow. I needed to understand why she was doing this, and more importantly, I needed to protect David's memory and clear the air before these lies took on a life of their own. Emma didn't deserve to have her father's reputation destroyed, and neither did I deserve to live under the shadow of a narrative that turned my greatest love story into something ugly and false. Suddenly, the pieces aligned. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The weight of what I'd learned pressed against my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe normally. I needed answers, and I needed them from Sarah herself. The thought of confronting her made my hands shake as I poured my coffee, but the alternative, letting these lies spread further through our community, was unbearable. I drove to Sarah's house on Maple Street, the same route I'd taken countless times over the years, for book club meetings, birthday parties, and casual visits. Her garden was immaculate as always, with late autumn chrysanthemums blooming in neat rows along the walkway. Everything looked exactly as it should, which somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. How could someone who maintained such perfect flower beds be systematically destroying my husband's reputation? Sarah answered the door wearing her usual warm smile, the one that had always made me feel welcome in her home. She was dressed in a soft blue sweater and dark jeans, her gray hair pulled back in the casual ponytail she favored on weekends. For a moment, seeing her familiar face, I almost doubted what I'd learned. This was the woman who had held me while I sobbed at David's funeral, who had organized meal trains during his illness. "Margaret, what a lovely surprise. Come in, I just put on a fresh pot of coffee." She stepped aside, gesturing toward her living room with the same gracious hospitality she'd always shown. I followed her inside, my heart pounding so hard I was certain she could hear it. The living room was cozy and inviting, filled with family photos and the scent of cinnamon candles. We settled into the familiar spots where we'd had so many conversations over the years, she in her favorite armchair, me on the end of the sofa closest to her. "I need to ask you something, Sarah," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've been hearing some disturbing things around town. About David?" Something flickered across her face, so quickly I almost missed it. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, but her eyes had changed. They were more guarded now, calculating. "What kind of things?" she asked, reaching for her coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "People seem to think he was abusive. That he hurt me." I watched her carefully as I spoke. "Emma came home upset because her friends' mothers have been asking her strange questions about her father. Janet mentioned hearing rumors." Sarah set down her cup and leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting into what I recognized as her concerned friend face. But now it looked rehearsed, like an actor slipping into a role. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this on top of everything else," she said, her voice full of sympathy that no longer felt genuine. "You know how people talk in small towns. They see a widow who's struggling, and they start making assumptions." But where would these assumptions come from, Sarah? David and I were happy. Everyone knew that. We never fought in public. Never gave anyone reason to think otherwise. I kept my voice level, but inside, I was screaming. "These aren't just random rumors. Someone is telling people specific things about my marriage." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost see her mind working, deciding how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed subtly. There was something defensive in it now, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Margaret, I think you might be reading too much into casual conversations. People are concerned about you because you've been struggling. They're trying to understand why you're having such a hard time moving forward. The way she said, moving forward, made my stomach clench. It was the same phrase she'd been using for months, always with that gentle but persistent pressure to stop grieving, to start dating, to let go of David's memory. I'm struggling because I lost the love of my life, I said firmly. That's normal. That's healthy grief, Sarah. What's not normal is someone spreading lies about an abusive marriage that never existed. Her mask slipped then, just for a moment, and I saw something ugly underneath. Resentment, maybe. Or anger. It was gone so quickly, I might have imagined it, but the chill it left behind was real. I think you should go, Margaret, she said quietly, standing up from her chair. You're upset, and you're not thinking clearly. Maybe when you've had time to calm down, we can talk about this rationally. I stood too, my legs unsteady beneath me. Sarah, please, just tell me the truth. Did you tell people David was abusive? She walked toward the front door, clearly expecting me to follow. Her movements were stiff, controlled, like someone barely keeping their composure. I think you're creating problems that don't exist, she said without turning around. You should focus on healing instead of looking for someone to blame for your pain. But as I reached the doorway, she turned back to face me, and what I saw in her eyes made my blood run cold. There was no warmth there anymore, no friendship, no compassion, just a cold calculation that I'd never seen before in all our years of knowing each other. You know, Margaret, she said softly, sometimes the wives are the last ones to see what everyone else knows. Sometimes they're so invested in the fantasy that they can't accept the reality. The implication hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just spreading lies about David. She was suggesting that I was delusional, that I was so damaged I couldn't see my own abuse. The carefully constructed narrative became crystal clear in that moment. I wasn't just a grieving widow in her version of events. I was a traumatized victim in denial, someone who needed to be saved from her own memories. I left without another word, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start my car. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions that felt impossible to answer. How long had she been planning this? What did she hope to gain by destroying David's reputation? And most terrifyingly, how far was she willing to go to make her version of our story the accepted truth? The drive home passed in a blur of stop signs and traffic lights that I barely registered. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, and I kept replaying Sarah's final words. The way she'd looked at me, like I was something to be pitied and managed rather than believed. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing had crystallized in my mind. I needed to call Emma. My sister had met Sarah dozens of times over the years, had been to dinner parties and holiday gatherings where Sarah played the role of devoted friend. If anyone would understand how surreal this felt, it would be Emma. I found her number and dialed before I could second-guess myself. Margaret, what's wrong? You sound terrible. Emma's voice was sharp with immediate concern, and I realized I must sound as shattered as I felt. I took a shaky breath and tried to organize my thoughts. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Sarah ever said anything to you about David? About our marriage? There was a pause that stretched too long, and my heart sank. What kind of things? Emma asked carefully. Just answer me, please. Has she said anything that made you think David was abusive? The silence that followed felt like an eternity. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was quiet and cautious. "Margaret, I didn't want to upset you. You've been through so much, and I thought maybe she was just worried about you. But yes, she's made some comments. Subtle things, mostly, about how you seem different since David died, how sometimes abuse victims idealize their abusers after death because it's easier than facing the truth. I felt like I was falling." "When? When did she say these things?" "The first time was at David's funeral, actually. I was so angry I almost confronted her right there, but I thought maybe grief was making her say strange things. Then she brought it up again at Christmas, and again when I ran into her at the grocery store last month. My vision blurred with tears of rage and betrayal." "And you believed her?" "No." Emma's voice was fierce now. "God, no, Margaret. I lived through David's courtship with you, remember? I saw how he looked at you, how gentle he was. I was there for your entire marriage. I know what love looks like, and I know what abuse looks like too. What you had with David was real love." The relief was so overwhelming I had to sit down on my kitchen floor. "But Emma, why didn't you tell me she was saying these things?" "Because I didn't want to add to your pain. And honestly, I thought I was the only one she'd approached. I figured she was just processing her own grief in a weird way and would stop eventually." I closed my eyes and leaned against the cabinet door. "She's not stopping. I confronted her today, and she basically told me I was in denial about my own abuse. She's been telling people this story for months." "That sick, manipulative—" Emma's voice trailed off into words I couldn't quite catch, but the tone was clear enough. "Margaret, what is she trying to accomplish here? What does she gain by destroying David's memory?" "I don't know, but Emma, there's something else. Something I haven't wanted to admit even to myself." I took a deep breath and forced myself to voice the suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind since I'd first heard about Sarah's lies. "I think Sarah had feelings for David. I think she's been in love with him for years, maybe since before we were even married. There were little things, signs I ignored because I trusted her. The way she'd touch his arm when she talked to him, how she always seemed to position herself next to him in group photos, how she'd make these little jokes about me not appreciating him enough." Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her thinking. "You know what? That actually makes a horrible kind of sense. If she convinced herself that David was trapped in an abusive marriage, then she could play the role of his would-be savior. And now that he's gone and can't contradict her version of events, she gets to be the woman who understood him when his own wife didn't." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than I'd imagined. "Emma, I don't know what to do. How do I fight this? How do I prove that a wonderful marriage was exactly what it seemed to be? First, you document everything, every conversation, every person she's talked to, every lie she's told. And second, you remember that the people who really knew you and David will see through this eventually." But even as Emma said it, I wondered if that was true. Sarah was convincing, and grief made people want simple explanations for complex emotions. How many of our mutual friends would find it easier to believe her version than to sit with the messy reality of deep, uncomplicated love cut short? After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen as darkness fell around me, thinking about the woman I'd considered one of my closest friends. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call Michael. If Sarah had been spreading her poison to Emma, there was a good chance she'd approached my brother too. And if I was going to fight this, I needed to know exactly how far her lies had spread. But as I finally climbed the stairs to bed, One terrifying thought kept circling back. What if this was just the beginning? I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as I replayed every interaction I'd had with Sarah over the past few months. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Michael before I could lose my nerve. "Hey, sis, you're up early," Michael answered. But I could hear the wariness in his voice that told me everything I needed to know. "Michael, we need to talk. Has Sarah been in touch with you recently?" The long pause that followed felt like a confirmation. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Margaret, I wasn't sure how to bring this up. She called me about 2 weeks ago. She said she was worried about you, that you weren't dealing with David's death in a healthy way." "What exactly did she tell you?" "She said that you were in denial about your marriage, that David had been controlling and emotionally abusive, and that you were romanticizing the relationship instead of processing the trauma." Michael's words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them. "She said she'd tried to help you see the truth, but you weren't ready to hear it." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. "And what did you say?" I told her that wasn't the David I knew. I mean, Margaret, I lived with you guys for 3 months when I was between apartments. I saw how he treated you every single day. He adored you. Relief flooded through me. "Thank you for saying that." "But Margaret, she was very convincing. She had specific examples of things David supposedly said to you, ways he allegedly isolated you from friends. She made it sound like she'd been watching this happen for years and trying to protect you." "Like what? What examples?" Michael hesitated. "She said David used to criticize your appearance, make you feel bad about your weight. She said he'd roll his eyes when you talked about your work and made jokes about your intelligence. She claimed he monitored your spending and got angry when you bought things without asking him first." The lies were so specific, so detailed, that I could see how they might seem credible to someone who hadn't lived my daily reality. But they were also so completely opposite to who David was that it felt like Sarah was describing a stranger. "Michael, you know that's not true. You saw us together. Did David ever do any of those things when you were staying with us?" "No, never. That's why I defended you both. But Sarah said abusers are good at hiding their behavior, especially from men. She said women see the signs that men miss." I felt a chill run down my spine. Sarah had an answer for everything, a way to twist any evidence of David's kindness into proof of his manipulation. "She's lying, Michael. All of it. David never criticized my appearance. He used to leave little notes telling me I was beautiful. He was proud of my work. He bragged about my achievements to anyone who would listen. And the money thing? We had joint accounts. We made decisions together." "I believe you," Michael said quietly. "I just don't understand why Sarah would make this up." Before I could respond, my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Sarah standing on my front porch, holding what looked like a casserole dish. "Michael, I have to go. Sarah's here. Do you want me to come over?" I considered it for a moment. Part of me wanted the backup, the witness. But another part of me knew this confrontation needed to happen between Sarah and me alone. "No, but thank you. I'll call you later." I hung up and took a deep breath before opening the door. Sarah smiled brightly, holding up the dish. "I brought you that chicken and rice casserole you used to love. I thought you might not be eating enough." The casual normalcy of her tone, the concerned expression on her face, it was all so perfectly performed. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been touched by the gesture. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Sarah set the casserole on my kitchen counter, and turned to face me with that same worried expression I'd grown used to over the past months. "How are you holding up, honey? Emma mentioned you seemed upset when you talked yesterday." The fact that she brought up Emma immediately told me she knew exactly why I'd called her here. "Sarah, we need to talk. About the things you've been telling people about David." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "What things?" "You know what things. You've been telling people that David was abusive, that our marriage was unhealthy, that I'm in denial about who he really was." Sarah sat down at my kitchen table, her face arranging itself into a mask of gentle concern. "Margaret, I know this is hard to hear, but I'm worried about you. You're not processing David's death in a healthy way. You've put him on this pedestal, and it's preventing you from moving forward." "Moving forward from what exactly? From a happy marriage? From loving my husband?" "From the reality of what your relationship actually was." Sarah's voice remained soft, patient, like she was talking to a confused child. "I saw how he treated you, Margaret. The way he'd dismiss your opinions, the way he'd make those little cutting remarks disguised as jokes, the way you'd apologize for things that weren't your fault." I stared at her, amazed by the conviction in her voice. She almost sounded like she believed what she was saying. "That never happened, Sarah. Not once." "It did happen. You've just blocked it out because it's too painful to acknowledge." She reached across the table as if to take my hand, but I pulled away. "Margaret, I was there. I saw it, and I should have said something sooner, but I didn't want to interfere in your marriage." The audacity of it took my breath away. She was rewriting history so completely, so confidently, that for just a moment, I wondered if I was the one going crazy. But then I remembered David's laugh, the way his face lit up when I walked into a room, the way he'd pull me close and whisper that he couldn't believe he'd gotten so lucky. I remembered the thousand small kindnesses, the way he'd bring me coffee in bed every morning, the way he'd listen to me talk about my day like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. "You're lying," I said simply. Sarah's mask finally slipped just for a second. I saw something cold and angry flash across her face before the concerned expression returned. "Margaret, denial is a powerful thing, but you can't heal until you face the truth." "The truth?" "The truth is that you were in love with my husband." The silence that followed my accusation stretched between us like a chasm. Sarah's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling back into that infuriating mask of concern. "Margaret, that's a very hurtful thing to say. I was David's friend too, but I was your friend first. Everything I'm doing is because I care about you." "No, Sarah. Everything you're doing is because you can't stand that David chose me, that he loved me completely and never looked at you the way you wanted him to." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This paranoia, this inability to see reality clearly. You're creating elaborate fantasies to avoid dealing with your grief." "Am I?" "Then explain something to me, Sarah. Explain why you volunteered to help plan David's funeral and then tried to change every single detail I'd requested. Explain why you insisted on giving a eulogy when his own brother was supposed to speak. Explain why you showed up at our anniversary dinner 2 years ago, claiming you'd forgotten we had plans." Each example hit its mark. I could see Sarah's composure cracking, the careful facade beginning to crumble. I was being supportive. I was being a good friend. You were inserting yourself into my marriage every chance you got. And now that David's gone, You're trying to rewrite our entire relationship so that somehow, in your mind, he was never really mine at all." Sarah's hands were shaking now, and her voice had lost that therapist-like calm. "You don't know what you're talking about. You never knew what you had. David was wasted on you." There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind months of fake concern and manufactured stories about abuse. He was wasted on me because I didn't appreciate him enough? Or because he should have been with you instead? He should have been with someone who understood him, someone who shared his interests, who could keep up with his mind, not someone who nodded along and smiled whenever he talked about his work. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. "I supported his career for 15 years, Sarah. I moved across the country twice for his promotions. I listened to him work through every major decision because my opinion mattered to him." "Your opinion?" Sarah laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "He used to complain about how you never really engaged with anything important. How you just agree with whatever he said because you couldn't be bothered to form your own thoughts." The lie was so outrageous, so completely fabricated, that I actually felt sorry for her. She'd constructed an entire alternate reality where David was unhappy with me, where he confided in her, where she was the one he really wanted. When did he supposedly tell you these things, Sarah? During all those private conversations you two never had? David talked to me about everything. If he'd been confiding in you, I would have known. You would have known because you monitored his every move? Because you were so controlling that he couldn't have a friend without your permission? She was spiraling now, throwing accusations like grenades, hoping something would stick. I would have known because we were partners, because he came home every day and told me about his day, including the people he'd talked to. Your name came up maybe once a month, usually in passing. That hit home. Sarah's face flushed red, and I saw her hands clench into fists. "You're delusional, Margaret. You've created this fantasy marriage that never existed, and now you're lashing out at anyone who tries to help you see the truth. The only person living in a fantasy here is you, Sarah. And I'm done letting you poison other people against David's memory, just so you can feel better about being rejected." The word rejected hung in the air between us, Sarah went very still, and when she spoke again, her voice was deadly quiet. "David never rejected me because David never knew how I felt. I was too good a friend to both of you to ever act on it." Finally, the admission I'd been waiting for. Too good a friend? Is that what you call spreading lies about him being abusive? Is that what you call trying to convince everyone that our marriage was a sham? I never said he was abusive. I said there were patterns that concerned me. And maybe I was wrong about some of it, but I still think you're not dealing with your grief in a healthy way. She was backpedaling now, trying to soften the damage, but it was too late. The mask was off, and we both knew it. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced at it automatically. A text from Emma. "How did it go with Sarah? Call me later." I stared at Sarah, watching her try to reconstruct her crumbling facade. The admission hung between us like smoke, and I could see her calculating how much damage she'd done to herself. "So, you're saying you made it all up?" I said slowly. "The concerns about patterns? The suggestions that David was controlling? The worried looks when people mentioned how happy we were together? All because you were in love with my husband and couldn't handle that he didn't feel the same way." "That's not what I said." Sarah's voice had lost its earlier venom and taken on a pleading quality. "I genuinely worried about some of the things I saw. Maybe my feelings colored my interpretation, but the concern was real." "What things, Sarah?" What exactly did you see that made you think David was abusive? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I watched her scramble for specifics that didn't exist. The way he made decisions for both of you sometimes? Like when he picked that restaurant for your anniversary dinner without asking what you wanted? I almost laughed. He surprised me with reservations at the place where we had our first date. I cried happy tears when he told me. You were there, Sarah. You saw how thrilled I was. But he didn't ask first. It was a surprise. That's what surprises are. The absurdity of having to explain this to a grown woman wasn't lost on me. Sarah, you're grasping at straws. You took normal couple behavior and twisted it into something sinister because it hurt too much to accept that David chose me. Her composure finally cracked completely. Tears started flowing, and her carefully controlled mask dissolved into something raw and desperate. You don't understand what it was like, she whispered. Watching him light up when he talked about you. Seeing how happy you made him when I would have given anything for him to look at me that way just once. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for her. The pain in her voice was real, even if her actions had been inexcusable. I do understand, Sarah. I understand heartbreak. But what I don't understand is how you could claim to care about David and then systematically destroy his reputation after he died. He can't defend himself. He can't tell people who he really was. I never meant for it to go this far, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. At first, I was just trying to help you. You seemed so lost, so broken, and I thought if people understood that your marriage wasn't perfect, they'd be more patient with your grief process. My marriage wasn't perfect, because no marriage is perfect. But it was good, Sarah. It was solid and loving and everything I ever wanted. Your version of help was actually character assassination? She flinched at my words, but I wasn't done. Do you have any idea what it's like to have people look at you with pity? To have them whisper about how David really was when you're trying to mourn the man you loved? You didn't just hurt me, Sarah. You hurt David's parents, his sister, everyone who cared about him. I know. Her voice was barely audible. I know I messed up, but once I started, I didn't know how to stop. Every time someone asked me about you, I just kept building on what I'd said before. I leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through this confrontation was fading, leaving me drained. How many people, Sarah? How many people did you tell your version of our marriage to? She looked down at her hands. I don't know. Maybe a dozen? People from our friend group, some of the neighbors, a few people from David's work who I ran into. A dozen people, each of whom had probably told others, spreading Sarah's poison like a virus through our community. The scope of the damage was staggering. And what exactly did you tell them? I need to know how bad this is. I told them that David could be controlling, that he made a lot of decisions without consulting you, that he had a temper sometimes. She paused, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I told them that you seemed afraid to disagree with him. Each lie felt like a physical blow. David, who had spent 10 minutes every morning asking if I was happy with the coffee he'd made. David, who had never raised his voice to me once in 8 years of marriage. David, who had postponed a promotion because I wasn't sure I was ready to move to a new city. And people believed you. Some of them seemed surprised, but I think they trusted me because I was close to both of you. And you were behaving so differently after he died that it seemed to fit. I was grieving, Sarah. I was devastated because I'd lost the love of my life. Of course, I was different. I know that now. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what couldn't be undone. Finally, I looked up at her. So what happens now? Do you plan to keep letting people think David was abusive? Are you going to let his memory stay poisoned because it's easier than admitting you lied? Sarah's face crumpled again, but before she could answer, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. The sound made both Sarah and me freeze. Through the kitchen window, I could see Margaret's familiar silver Honda parked behind Sarah's car. My sister-in-law climbed out slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that made my stomach clench. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, her face going pale. I didn't know she was coming. Neither did I. My mouth felt dry as dust. Margaret had been David's older sister, his fierce protector since childhood, and she'd loved him with the kind of unwavering loyalty that made her dangerous when crossed. If she'd heard even a fraction of what Sarah had been spreading around town, this was about to get much worse. The front door opened without a knock. Margaret had kept her key after David died, something that had comforted me in those early weeks when I couldn't bear to be alone. Now, hearing her measured footsteps crossing the hardwood floor of the entryway, it felt ominous. "Emma?" Her voice carried that particular tone I remembered from David's childhood stories, the one that had made neighborhood bullies scatter and teachers reconsider their disciplinary decisions. I saw Sarah's car outside. Sarah shrank back against the refrigerator as Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway. David's sister was a small woman, barely 5'4", but she had a presence that filled rooms. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face, and her brown eyes, so much like David's, were cold with barely contained fury. "Margaret!" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. You were just what?" Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her gaze moving between us like she was assessing a crime scene. "Continuing to spread lies about my brother? Destroying his reputation to cover for your own guilty conscience?" My heart sank. She knew. Of course she knew. In a community this size, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and Margaret had always been plugged into every social network David had been part of. "How much have you heard?" I asked quietly. Margaret's expression softened slightly when she looked at me, but the anger remained simmering just beneath the surface. "Mrs. Chen from David's office called me yesterday. Apparently, Sarah here has been very busy explaining to people why you've been struggling so much since the accident." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. "Margaret, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "Explain how you decided my brother was a convenient scapegoat for your own failures as a friend? Explain how you thought it was acceptable to rewrite the story of a man who can't defend himself?" The kitchen felt smaller with Margaret's rage filling it. I could see my own devastation reflected in her face, but multiplied and sharpened into something that made me take a step back. "She was just trying to help," I said weakly, though the words tasted bitter. "Help?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Emma, do you know what Mrs. Patterson said to me at the grocery store this morning? She asked me how I was coping with the revelations about David's true nature. She told me how sorry she was that our family had to deal with such difficult secrets coming to light." The blood drained from my face. Mrs. Patterson had been David's third-grade teacher, a woman who had attended our wedding and sent us Christmas cards every year. The thought of her gentle, grandmotherly face twisted with pity and judgment made me feel sick. "Margaret, I never meant," Sarah started. "You never meant what? For people to believe you? For your lies to spread?" What exactly did you think would happen when you started telling people that David was controlling and had a temper? Margaret's voice was rising with each word. Did you think those kinds of accusations would just stay contained to a few conversations? I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The full scope of the damage was beginning to hit me in waves. It wasn't just about people pitying me or looking at me strangely. David's reputation, his memory, everything good and kind about him was being poisoned by Sarah's misguided attempt to help. I thought I was protecting Emma, Sarah said desperately. She was falling apart, and people were judging her for not handling things better. I thought if they understood why she was struggling. You thought you'd throw David under the bus to make it easier for her? Margaret's voice was deadly quiet now, which was somehow worse than when she'd been shouting. You thought you'd destroy the memory of a man who never hurt anyone, who spent his entire adult life taking care of the people he loved? Sarah was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she pressed herself against the refrigerator like she was trying to disappear into it. But I found I had no sympathy left for her. The magnitude of what she'd done was settling over me like a suffocating blanket. How many people know? I asked Margaret. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. The anger was still there, but exhaustion was creeping in around the edges. It's hard to say. You know how this town works. But I've gotten 3 phone calls since yesterday, and Tom ran into someone from David's office who mentioned it to him. Tom? David's best friend since college, the man who had been his best man at our wedding. I closed my eyes, imagining that conversation. Tom had loved David like a brother, had known him better than almost anyone. The idea of him having to hear these lies, having to defend David's character to people who should have known better, made my chest tight with grief and fury. What did Tom say? I whispered. What do you think he said? He was furious. He wanted to drive over here and confront Sarah himself, but I told him I'd handle it. Margaret's gaze fixed on Sarah with laser intensity. Though now I'm wondering if I should have let him come. Sarah flinched. I know I screwed up. I know there's no excuse for what I did, but I was scared for Emma, and I didn't know what else to do. You could have tried actually helping instead of making things worse, Margaret snapped. You could have brought her groceries or helped her with errands, or just listened when she needed to talk. Instead, you decided to create a fictional version of her marriage to make yourself feel better about not knowing how to be a real friend. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah's sobs were the only sound for a long moment, punctuated by the steady tick of the clock on the kitchen wall. The normalcy of that sound felt surreal against the backdrop of this confrontation. Finally, I looked up at both of them. So what do we do now? How do we fix this? Margaret's expression was grim. That's the problem, Emma. I don't know if we can. Just then, the kitchen door swung open again, and Tom walked in without knocking, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like barely controlled grief. Tom, I breathed, my heart sinking further. Of all the people to walk in on this confrontation, David's best friend was perhaps the worst possible choice. The raw pain in his eyes told me he'd already heard everything from Margaret, and seeing Sarah here was only making it worse. I told you I'd handle this, Margaret said quietly, but Tom shook his head, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of David when he was trying to control his temper. No, I need to hear this from her. Tom's voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor underneath. He looked directly at Sarah, who had somehow managed to make herself even smaller against the refrigerator. I need to understand how you could say those things about David, about Emma. Sarah's tears had stopped, replaced by something that looked like terror. Tom had always been gentle, the kind of man who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and remembered everyone's birthdays. But there was something different in his posture now, a protective fury that made the kitchen feel smaller. "Tom, please," Sarah whispered. "I never meant for it to get this far." "But you meant for it to get somewhere, didn't you?" His voice was getting louder now, and I could see Margaret shifting uncomfortably in her chair. "You didn't just slip up once. You built an entire story, piece by piece, conversation by conversation. You made Emma into some kind of victim, and David into a monster." I watched this unfold with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life imploding. These three people had been fixtures in my world for years. Sarah had been my closest friend since college, the one who knew about my anxiety attacks and helped me practice job interviews. Tom had been David's chosen family, the brother he never had. Margaret had been the mother-in-law who actually felt like a mother, who called on Sundays just to chat and remembered every doctor's appointment. Now, they were all here in my kitchen, and everything was falling apart. "I was worried about her," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "After the funeral, she wouldn't leave the house. She wouldn't eat. She was so thin and sad, and when people asked me how she was doing, I didn't know what to say." "So you decided to lie," Tom said flatly. "Instead of saying your friend was grieving, instead of saying she lost the love of her life, you decided it would be easier to pretend he was abusive." Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a growl. "That's exactly what you did, isn't it? You took Emma's grief and twisted it into something ugly because you couldn't handle the real truth." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I wanted. "What's the real truth, Margaret?" "Because right now I feel like I don't know anything anymore." The three of them turned to look at me, and I saw my own confusion reflected in their faces. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady. "The real truth is that you lost your husband when you were 34 years old," she said gently. "The real truth is that he died in a car accident on his way home from work, thinking about what to make you for dinner. The real truth is that you've been trying to figure out how to live without the person who is your whole world, and that's the hardest thing any human being can do." Tom nodded, his anger softening slightly as he looked at me. "The real truth is that David loved you more than anything, and you loved him the same way? And losing that kind of love leaves marks on a person. It changes you. But those changes don't need to be explained away or justified to anyone." Sarah was crying again, but quietly now, the kind of tears that come from deep shame rather than self-pity. "I thought I was protecting you," she said to me. "I thought if people understood why you were struggling, they'd be more patient with you." "But I wasn't struggling because David hurt me," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. "I was struggling because he didn't hurt me, because he was good and kind, and he made me laugh every single day, and then he was just gone." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths. Tom pulled out the remaining chair and sat down, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that was so much like David, it made my chest ache. "So, where does that leave us?" he asked finally. "How do we fix this?" But before anyone could answer, my phone rang from the counter, and I could see Sarah's name on the display. We all stared at it for a moment before I realized what was happening. "That's not Sarah calling," I said slowly. looking at her confused face. "Sarah's right here." Tom reached for the phone, his expression growing dark. "Then who has been using Sarah's name to call you?" The phone continued to ring, its shrill tone cutting through the kitchen like a blade. We all stared at it, frozen in a tableau of confusion and growing dread. Sarah's face had gone completely white, her hands trembling as she looked between the phone and us. "I don't understand," she whispered. "That's my name on your phone, but I'm right here." Tom reached for the device, but I grabbed it first, my thumb hovering over the decline button. The caller ID clearly showed Sarah's name, the same contact photo I'd taken of her laughing at David's birthday party 2 years ago, back when everything was normal and whole. "How long has this been happening?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Emma, how long have you been getting calls from Sarah that weren't actually Sarah?" I tried to think back through the fog of the last few months. The grief had made everything blurry, days bleeding into nights, conversations mixing together in my memory like watercolors in the rain. But slowly, pieces began to surface. "The calls started about 6 weeks after the funeral," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The phone finally stopped ringing, leaving us in a silence that felt more oppressive than the noise had been. Someone would call, usually late at night when I was having trouble sleeping. They'd use your voice, Sarah. They'd say things like how David had been controlling, how they'd been worried about me for years, but hadn't known how to help. Sarah's face crumpled. "Emma, I never made those calls. I swear to you, I never said those things about David. I would never." But even as she protested, I could see something shifting in her expression, a dawning horror that made my stomach clench with fear. "Sarah?" Tom's voice was gentle but insistent. "What is it? What are you thinking?" She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked my small backyard, where David used to tend his tomato plants. The morning light caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shine like silver threads. "I did tell someone," she said finally, her back still turned to us. "About David's death, about how you were struggling. I thought, God, I was so stupid. I thought they cared." Margaret and Tom exchanged a look across the table, and I felt something cold settle in my chest like a stone. "Who did you tell, Sarah?" I asked, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. She turned around, and the anguish in her eyes made me want to look away. "My sister. I told my sister everything, about the funeral, about how you couldn't sleep, about how you'd lost weight and stopped answering your phone. I was worried about you, and I needed someone to talk to about it." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in around us. I remembered Sarah's sister, though we'd only met a handful of times over the years. There had always been something about her that made me uncomfortable, a way she had of asking questions that felt less like concern and more like gathering ammunition. "But why would she pretend to be you?" Tom asked. "What could she possibly gain from that?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. "You don't know my sister like I do. She's always been jealous of my friendships. She can't stand that I have relationships she's not part of. And she's been obsessed with the idea that people are lying to her, hiding things from her." The phone buzzed with a text message, and we all jumped. I looked down at the screen, and there it was. Another message from Sarah. "She's been using your contact information somehow," I said, showing them the text. "Look at this." The message read, "Emma, I'm so sorry I missed your call. I was just thinking about how David used to get so angry when you talked to your friends. Remember how he'd sulk for days? I should have said something sooner." Sarah read it over my shoulder, her face growing paler with each word. That's not how I text. And Emma, I never thought any of those things about David. He was wonderful to you. Margaret reached for the phone, studying the message with the intensity she usually reserved for her crossword puzzles. This is calculated, she said quietly. Someone has been systematically feeding you lies about your husband, using Sarah's identity to make them seem credible. The full weight of what had been done to me settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. Someone had taken my grief, my vulnerability, my trust in my closest friend, and weaponized it all to poison my memories of the man I loved. But why? I asked, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. What could she possibly want from this? Before anyone could answer, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a different name entirely, one that made Sarah gasp and grab the back of her chair for support. It was Sarah's sister, calling from her own number this time. And somehow, that felt infinitely more terrifying than the fake calls ever had. I stared at the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ringing seemed to echo through the kitchen, each tone more ominous than the last. Don't answer it, Sarah said quickly, but her voice shook. Please, Emma, not yet. Tom leaned forward in his chair. What aren't you telling us about your sister, Sarah? The phone stopped ringing, leaving us in a silence that felt charged with electricity. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. My sister has always had this need to control everything around her, Sarah began, her words coming slowly, as if each one cost her something. When we were kids, she'd tell my friends that I'd said terrible things about them, just to isolate me. She'd intercept phone calls, change plans without telling me, make sure I was always dependent on her. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. And now she's doing the same thing to Emma, using you as the weapon. But I moved away from all that, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. I built my own life, made my own friends. I thought she'd finally moved on, found her own path. I haven't even talked to her in months. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. We all stared at it like it might explode. She called me once after David died, I said suddenly, the memory surfacing like something dredged up from deep water. I remember now. She said she was checking on me for you, Sarah. Said you were too worried to call yourself because you didn't want to upset me. Sarah's face went white. I never asked her to do that. Emma, I called you myself dozens of times those first few weeks. But I was so scattered then, I said, pieces clicking together in my mind. I barely remembered who I talked to or when. She could have called right after you did, and I wouldn't have remembered the difference. Tom stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders tense. So she's been planning this for months, studying how Emma grieves, learning the right things to say, the right timing. The thought made my stomach turn. While I'd been drowning in loss, someone had been watching, calculating, turning my pain into something they could use. But why target David's memory? I asked. What could she possibly gain from making me think he was abusive? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because she knows that would hurt you the most. And because... She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. Because she's always been jealous of happy relationships. She used to say the cruelest things about David when you weren't around. How it wasn't fair that you got the perfect husband when she couldn't keep anyone. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about all the conversations I'd had with the fake Sarah, How each one had chipped away at my memories of David, replacing love with doubt, joy with fear. I almost believed her, I whispered. There were moments when I started questioning everything David ever did, reinterpreting his kindness as control, his love as manipulation. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. But you didn't believe it completely. That's why you called Sarah today. Some part of you knew something was wrong. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the fake Sarah number. Emma, please call me back. I'm worried about you. Sarah looked at the message and something shifted in her face, a hardness I'd never seen before. She's not going to stop. This is what she does. She pushes and pushes until she gets what she wants. What does she want? Tom asked, turning back from the window. For Emma to be isolated, confused, dependent. Sarah's voice grew steadier as she spoke. She wants to be the only voice Emma trusts, the only person who understands her pain. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The gradual escalation of the fake conversations. The way they'd made me doubt not just David, but my own perceptions. The subtle encouragement to pull away from other friends, to rely only on Sarah's version of events. She almost succeeded, I said. Margaret squeezed my hand. But she didn't, and now we know what she's doing. My phone rang again. Sarah's sister calling from her own number once more. This time, I looked at my 3 friends, my real friends, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Certainty. I'm going to answer it, I said. Emma, you don't have to, Tom said quickly. Yes, I do. I stood up, feeling steadier than I had since this whole nightmare began. She's stolen months of my grief, poisoned my memories of my husband, and used my best friend's identity to do it. I'm not going to let her keep hiding behind lies. I swiped to answer the call and put it on speaker so the others could hear. Emma? The voice was similar to Sarah's, but with subtle differences I could hear now that I was listening for them. I've been trying to reach you. I know exactly who this is, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. And I know what you've been doing. There was a pause, then a laugh that sent chills down my spine. I don't know what you mean. You've been pretending to be your sister? Calling me, texting me, telling me lies about my husband? Emma, you sound confused. Are you taking care of yourself? Grief can make people paranoid. Sarah is sitting right here next to me, I interrupted. The real Sarah. We've compared notes. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, dropping the pretense of concern. You were so easy to manipulate, she said, and now I could hear the coldness that had been hidden beneath the fake sympathy. So desperate to understand your own pain that you'd believe anything. Sarah grabbed the phone from my hand. How could you do this? To Emma, to me, to David's memory? Because I could, came the reply. Because perfect Emma with her perfect marriage needed to understand what loss really feels like. I lost my husband, I said, taking the phone back. I understood loss just fine. But you still had your precious memories, didn't you? Your certainty that you were loved. Some of us never get that luxury. The naked bitterness in her voice was almost overwhelming, but underneath it, I heard something else. A profound loneliness that made me feel almost sorry for her. Almost. That doesn't give you the right to torture someone else, Tom said, leaning toward the phone. This conversation is over, I said firmly. Don't contact me again. Don't use your sister's name. Don't pretend to care about my well-being when you've spent months systematically destroying it. You can't prove any of this, she said, but her voice wavered. I don't need to prove it to anyone but myself, I replied. I know the truth now. About David, about you, about everything you've tried to take from me. I hung up and immediately blocked both numbers. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, all of us processing what had just happened. Then Sarah started crying, not the gentle tears of sympathy, but deep, racking sobs. I'm so sorry, she said between breaths. I'm so sorry she used me to hurt you. I'm sorry I didn't figure it out sooner. I pulled her into a hug and felt Tom and Margaret's arms come around both of us. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of doubt about David, about my marriage, about my own memories. She didn't win, I said softly. She tried to take away my love for David, but it's still here. It's still real. We stayed like that for a long time. 4 friends holding each other up in my kitchen, surrounded by the debris of lies that no longer had power over us. When we finally pulled apart, Margaret wiped her eyes and said, What do you need from us now? I thought about it, really thought about it. Help me remember the real David. Help me trust my own memories again. And that's exactly what they did.